Apparently everyone is so anxious to hear from our candidates, you want to start at 6:57. I think we'll wait a few more minutes, though, just in case some people are just arriving. All right. Good evening, Edmonton-Strathcona and friends. Are there any non-Edmonton-Strathconians in the audience today? Welcome. I'm sure you'll be moving in soon. My name is Deborah Davidson. I'm a professor here at the University of Alberta, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to moderate tonight's discussion of what many consider to be the most important set of issues that we face today, the environment and climate change. I'd like to thank everyone for attending tonight's event. This is one of the 100 debates on the environment being held across Canada in anticipation of the upcoming federal election. There are actually 104 debates taking place, but only 4 are taking place here in Alberta. Edmonton-Strathcona is being called one of the key battlegrounds in the upcoming election, so it's fitting that we hold one of those 4 elections right here at home. I would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that we're located on Treaty 6 territory. Treaty 6 is a traditional gathering place for many Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many other peoples. Their histories, language, knowledge, and cultures continue to influence our community today. I also want to let everyone know that this event will be recorded and made available on the internet as well as live streamed. We have a number of sponsors to thank for tonight's debate, too many for me to mention here and now, but I do want to highlight 2 in particular which provided the funding to help us with the ability to live stream tonight. One is the Sustainability Council, and the other is the Cooley Institute for Advanced Studies. Now I want to lay out some ground rules for the evening. In order to maintain a welcoming and respectful and nonpartisan environment for the candidates, and to provide our audience and listeners with the opportunity to hear what their parties and candidates' positions are. First, there will be absolutely no tolerance for any hate speech, personal attacks towards candidates or other participants, or any other disrespectful behavior. In order to have a productive conversation and a healthy democracy, respect for one another is absolutely essential. In addition, please, no party signs, banners, or leaflets in the room. Let's keep our campaigning outside, please. And then third, So that we can all get home tonight, our debate is tightly structured for discussions between our candidates and the community. So we please ask you to refrain from commenting, booing, or otherwise interrupting the candidates, and withhold your applause until the end of the evening. If you want to respond to what is being said, you have some options. The first one, each of you will see a sticky note in front of you. Write a question for your candidates on the sticky notes provided. You may write your questions in either English or French and pass it down the row where our volunteers will be collecting them. During the break, co-moderators are going to go through your sticky notes and formulate 3 final questions for our candidates. I want to thank all contributors, question contributors in advance for doing so, and I want to ensure you that even though we will not be able to cover every issue and question that is raised, care will be taken to identify the most prominent themes and topics. And I strongly encourage you to follow up with candidates with your questions if they do not get discussed tonight. I also want to ask you to please formulate your questions and pass down your sticky notes before the break, because our break is going to be very short and our moderators will have a very limited amount of time to be able to synthesize them. You can also tweet or otherwise post the debate on social media. And we have a number of hashtags that you could use for that purpose. And of course, you can otherwise express your views elsewhere later. So the organizing committee for this event followed the criteria for inclusion in the federal leaders' debates, adopted by the Leaders' Debates Commission and by Green PAC for the 100 Debates on the Environment campaign. So now I would like to introduce the candidates who have joined us today who meet these criteria. Joining me at the table in front here, we have the candidate for the New Democratic Party, Ms. Heather McPherson. We have the candidate for the Liberal Party, Ms. Eleanor Olszewski. We have the candidate for the People's Party of Canada, Ian Cameron. And we have the candidate for the Green Party, Michael Kalmanovich. The Conservative Party also meets the criteria for inclusion, but their candidate, Sam Lilly, did not respond to our invitations to attend. We also will be providing space tonight for the candidate for the Marxist-Leninist Party for Canada for the Edmonton-Strathcona riding, Dr. Dougal MacDonald, and Ms. Naomi Rankin, the Communist Party candidate. Although these parties do not meet the criteria to be included in the debates, their candidacy in our riding is recognized, and we wanted to include their voice here tonight. So they will each have 5 minutes up here at the podium to present their responses to our questions after the debates are, after the panelists respond to their questions. So I want to thank all of our candidates for attending this evening. We recognize that this is a very busy time for you. So now I just want to explain the format that we're going to follow today. We're going to begin our evening with candidate responses to 4 questions covering a range of environmental concerns. Candidates were provided with the questions in advance. Those on the debate panel up here with me will each have a total of 3 minutes to respond to each question, and the order for responses will be rotated. Candidates have also been invited to respond in either English or French, and we have a translator for French responses. At the end of these questions, the Marxist-Leninist Party candidate and the Communist Party candidates will each have 5 minutes at the podium up here to respond to the questions and to the other candidates. And then we will take our 10-minute break. Once we reconvene, during the second half of the meeting, our candidates will respond to a selection of questions and concerns raised by you, and the 4 candidates on the panel will then each have 2 minutes to reply to each of these. All right, let's get started. The first question has to do with our climate crisis. So given that jurisdictions across Canada and around the world have declared a climate emergency, which in short means that leaders now recognize that we must not only mitigate against, but also adapt to the climate changes that are already underway, what kinds of actions and policies will you advocate for in Parliament? And how will you ensure that these actions and policies are proportionate to the emergency that they are intended to address? Let's begin with Ms. Olszewski.
Is that better? All right. Sorry about that. All right. You know, last week I marched in Climate Strike Edmonton, and it was absolutely an incredible experience marching with elementary and junior high school students and really feeling their passion about the environment. And absolutely one thing is crystal clear, and that is that Canadians are demanding action on climate change. I've heard it at the doors so many times as well that people not only want, but they expect a government that's going to take action. The Liberal Party is the only party, well, let me start by saying this. I'm proud to say that the Liberal Party has done more to cut emissions and act on climate change in its first mandate than any other party in Canadian government. We're the only party with a serious plan to protect the environment and fight climate change while growing our economy. And you know, the Liberals have introduced countless policies that span everything from cars to housing to protection of species to protection of lands and waters. We've implemented game-changing policies like putting a price on pollution and banning single-use plastics. And I know there's a tendency to think only about those two policies when people think about what the Liberal government has done. But actually, there are so many other steps that we've taken, including historic investments in infrastructure that help save the environment, that help create jobs, and that have the added effect of making our quality of life much better. We've raised fuel standards so that cars can run on cleaner fuels. We've provided incentives for people to buy zero-emission vehicles. We're phasing out coal by 2030, and in Platform 2019, we committed to taking steps that will drive Canada to net zero by 2050. And I just want to read to you a quote from Mark Jacquard, who's a professor of sustainable energy at SFU. And he says, in climate policy, experts agree that Canada is finally a global leader. I wonder if enough climate-concerned Canadians will recognize this before it's too late. And that was published in the National Observer today. So reducing emissions is one thing, but we also need to take steps to prepare for fires and floods and droughts as well. And the Liberals have put in place a fund that allows communities to do just that. And it's a $2 billion fund. And in fact, it was accessed by Mayor Don Iveson to help the residents of Park Ellen who underwent a terrible flood a number of years ago. And those monies will be used to help ameliorate against the effects.
Thank you, Ms. Olszewski. We'll have to stop there. I'm going to be the bad cop tonight. So I'm going to turn the mic over now to Mr. Cameron.
Thank you. So formally, I'll just outline the party platform, and then I'll speak about my own personal views on the matter. Formally, our party would like to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, abolish the Liberal carbon tax, and end corporate welfare for green technology. Now, before we move forward, I just want to say that I disagree with the first two. I do agree with ending corporate welfare, but I do want to state emphatically that climate change is real. Climate change is here and now. A carbon tax can be used successfully to offset emissions. So can a cap and trade system, and so can free market solutions. I think it will take probably a combination of all three to achieve the results that we desire. The People's Party of Canada advocates for free market principles, and as Eleanor has alluded, recent climate strike action has made it clear that many want and are demanding action. So that's my position. Thank you.
Mr. Cameron, you have some extra time. Did you want to take your time, or shall I allocate that to the remaining?
Fine.
Okay, very well. I would like to turn the microphone over in that case to Mr. Kalmanovich.
Hey. Hi. Thank you very much for having us here. I'm the Green candidate for the Green Party, and I'm not green. Though a climate emergency has been declared by the City of Edmonton with federal Liberals, which I really appreciate, it was mostly symbolic. It is the first step. Now we must move to important actions to deal with the emergency. Normally, when there is a state of emergency, we act immediately. Where are the acts of emergency by this government? If we were attacked by a foreign entity, we would respond immediately. Why are we not responding to this threat? Is it simply NIMTOO, not in my term of office, the proverbial lack of political will? In any emergency, you don't assess the costs before responding, you act. If we had flooding in Edmonton, we would just take care of it. If we had fires in Edmonton, we would act. We don't say, how much will that cost? And then it asks, what would we do as the Greens? I would implement a tax on all greenhouse gases, not just carbon. This would not only include carbon emissions from fossil fuels, gasoline, natural gas, diesel, but would include methane, refrigerants, etc. I would cease all fracking since it is a high source of methane release and a high polluting industry. We need to ensure that it is expensive to pollute so that less of it is done. I would not return this tax to the public, but would direct all of this tax to projects to build green infrastructure and programs. Since we will reduce income taxes for the middle class and the lower income brackets, this will approximately be revenue neutral for all people, except those rich people. Since it is a consumption tax, people have the opportunity to reduce this premium attached to the greenhouse gas emissions being emitted by their products and also by their activities. I would make a massive investment in the expansion of wind and solar installations across the country. I would start a program to assess all buildings for their environmental footprint and immediately retrofit them, thus creating thousands and thousands of jobs to the level that would reduce their energy costs. Again, lowering carbon consumption to operate them and therefore the cost of the building and the homeowners and tenants. I would promote a faster transition to a plant-based diet. This would involve education, a tax on meat and animal products that reflect their heavier environmental footprint, and support programs. I would invest in transit in all cities and intercity travel. I would divest from fossil fuels, like the University of Alberta should do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kamanovich. Now I'd like to turn it over to Ms. McPherson.
Thank you very much. So I'm running for the NDP because I think that the NDP has the best plan to get us where we need to go in a way that is effective. It will keep us where we need to be in terms of our targets. It is accountable. We will hold our government to account for what we promise to do. And I'm losing my last thing here. And it is actually achievable. So these are the three things that make me want to run for the NDP. I will tell you, the NDP is the first party that has been fighting for climate change. It is the party that has been fighting for climate change since Jack Layton introduced the bill in 2006, our Climate Change Accountability Act. And as you all know, our Member of Parliament, Linda Duncan, has been fighting for over a decade for climate change in this country. Linda Duncan has put forward our Bill of Rights, our Environmental Bill of Rights, 3 times, and the government has 3 times not put it through. I think what we've seen is that the NDP have been fighting the climate fight for a very long time. Linda Duncan, who's here with us today, has been fighting this fight for a very long time. This is part of why I want to put my name forward for the NDP party and why I want to do this work. I've been working in international development, sustainable development, and climate change issues for over 25 years. I am so tired of the fact that we time after time after time are told, yeah, we're going to make our targets. Yes, we're going to sign on to Kyoto. Yes, we're going to sign on to Paris. And we are not making them, and there is nothing holding our governments to account for when they fail to meet the targets that we set for ourselves, our international obligations. And I'll tell you something else working internationally. One of the things that's really important to note is that it is not just going to be people in Canada that suffer from the climate crisis. There are people around the world that are already suffering from the climate crisis. It is an enormously important thing that we act on now. And I can tell you a few of the things that the NDP are going to do. We are going to create 300,000 jobs across Canada in our first mandate. It is so important. If you are going to attack or address the climate crisis, you need to bring people with you. There needs to be jobs with that. We're going to stop the oil and gas subsidies. There's no reason for us to have those subsidies in place. We're going to make our transit better. We're going to make it electrified. We're going to make our cities better. We're retrofitting our homes. There are so many opportunities that we can do moving forward, that we can do in the short term, the medium, and the long term. And I'm so excited to get started, and I'm so excited to hold our government to account on reaching those targets. And that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. I would like to share the second question with you now. We're moving on to the topic of the regulation of toxic chemicals and plastics. There's now evidence that the oceans, fresh water, and even the Arctic ice have been contaminated with microplastics, and that these have entered our food chain. Plastics pollution is also killing marine life and other species around the world. Canadians are also very worried about the health and environmental effects of pesticide use, herbicide and pesticide use, and other chemicals that are licensed for use in Canada. So what actions should the next government of Canada take to prevent further contamination of our air, water, soil, and food? And please be specific as to legislative and regulatory reforms that you would support. Let's start this time with Mr. Cameron.
Thank you. The People's Party of Canada environmental stance is to reserve Canadian tax dollars to invest into concrete environmental improvements. Areas within Canada that have been subjected to hazardous materials or chemicals, contamination, etc., would fall into that category of concrete improvements, and that the People's Party of Canada would absolutely support. Although increased regulation isn't our thing really, it might not be desirable, there does need to be a clear connection to improving the environment. Recently, I think it was last week, the CBC exposed practices in the recycling industry that demonstrated that Canadian plastics wind up on the other side of the world in trash piles. This is not acceptable. Means of enforcement should be looked into and resources assigned to enforce illegal practices. And if they're not illegal, then maybe they should be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cameron. Let's move on now to Mr. Kalmanovich.
Thank you. I worked towards a lower toxic and waste-reduced world for almost 30 years. Well, actually longer, because I was involved with the Environmental Resource Center back in 1990 with household hazardous waste and eco-lifestyle. My business was founded on people using less packaging and refilling, reusing containers and bags, and reduction in toxic ingredients. We need a dramatic reduction in the production and use of plastic in our society. Initially, we would make a reduction in single-use plastic and packaging. This will involve implementing bans and programs to reduce the use of single-use plastic, carrier bags, produce bags, etc. These programs would be based on best practices, and their intention is to help with the behavioral shift that needs to happen so that people understand the program, support it, and participate in it. As for toxic chemicals, I would incorporate the precautionary principle into assessment of all chemicals. I would invest in supporting independent research into the effects of such chemicals, of each chemical on humans and the ecosystem, as well as their symbiotic effect or the synergistic effect. I would transition all agricultural towards certified organic and regenerative practices. I would immediately fade out many agricultural chemicals and synthetic fertilizers. I would cease the use of herbicides being used on forests. These are forests, not plantations. There are a lot of people that live in the forest, as well as non-target species of animals that get affected by that non-discriminatory spraying of herbicides. I would set up mobile monitoring vehicles that would gather data, and that data would be acted upon. We need data to make the best and most effective actions. I would increase fines and penalties for people that either individually or through a company pollute. It will be very expensive financially and personally to pollute under a government that I am involved in. Pollution and damages to the ecosystem should not be externalized. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kamanovich. Let's turn it over to Ms. McPherson.
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's important that we acknowledge that we live in a country with an enormous amount of fresh water. We live in a country that has an enormous amount of resources and natural wealth. What we have failed to do over the past number of years, number of subsequent governments, is we've failed to actually put in any sort of regulation that holds us to account, and actually any regulation that we evaluate, that we're actually keeping an eye on. So it's one thing to put in, you know, laws that say you can't do this and you can't do that. If we don't have any teeth, if we haven't actually committed to making sure that we're holding our front on that, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make it any good. And one of the things that I'm very worried about is that we have had parliamentary committees since 1999 that have been pushing for increases in how we actually evaluate and how we measure our toxins in our climate. And we haven't done it. And it hasn't been because we lack the will, or it has been because we lack the will. It hasn't been because we lack the science. It's because we haven't actually committed to it. Because there is something, you know, a little bit of a head in the sand situation. Whereas if we don't look at it, if we don't look at the problems that we have within our environment, we don't have to fix them. So the best thing then is that you don't measure them. You don't actually have a system in place to measure where toxins are in our environment, and then you don't have to fix that problem. I mean, we've seen time and time again populations that are really seriously impacted by toxins in our environment, and our government's failing to work on that. You know, we have never regulated mercury in coal. We have never actually looked at the tar sands and how we need to evaluate what's coming from there. We should be looking at that. We should be looking at what those impacts are. You know, Grassy Narrows is a perfect example of how the government has failed. And you know, we found out that there's another mercury spill that was upstream of Grassy Narrows. This is where we have to be holding the line. We have to be, as a country, as a government, we're responsible for making sure that we put regulations in place and that we follow those regulations.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. Next, we will turn it over to Ms. Olszewski.
Thank you very much. You know, the Liberal government has already taken steps to deal with the issue of plastic pollution that ends up in our landfills, on our parks, and our beaches, pollutes our waterways, and causes problems and harm to marine birds and animals. And we've committed to banning single-use plastics by 2021. This ban builds on our existing ban on plastics containing microbeads, which of course we know threatened our marine waterways, or our marine wildlife and waterways as well. We're also working on standards that will apply to businesses that produce plastic or sell plastic packaging, to make sure that we hold them responsible for cleaning up the plastic mess and for recycling the plastic that results from their use. The Liberal government's also taking historic steps to protect biodiversity and the loss of plants and animals and habitat by increasing the amount of nature that we protect. And this includes moving forward in 2025 to protect 25% of our lands and oceans. You know, in 2015, only 1% of our oceans were protected, and we're now at just under 14% oceans protected, and intend to move forward in every way. And this has prompted conservation experts like Alison Woodley at Canadian Parks and Wilderness. It's prompted people like her to laud these investments in land and water as significant steps for conservation in Canada. On CEPA, we're committed to reforming CEPA, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. That, in fact, that commitment is part of Platform 2019. So whether it's protection of air or land or water or managing the use of chemicals and toxins, the Liberal government will work to protect the environment and to grow the economy. And of course, that applies with respect to the use of pesticides as well, that we'll take all appropriate steps to make sure that we use the best science and evidence possible to reduce the effects of harmful chemicals and pesticides on our environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Olszewski, and thanks to all of you for respecting our time clock. This is, you're making my job very easy. Let's move on to the third question, which pertains to Indigenous rights. So projects like the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, Site C Dam, or the extension of Teck's Cheviot coal mine have faced opposition because of threats they pose to water and biological diversity, because of their contributions to climate change. Got it. Okay, thank you. And because they violate the rights of Indigenous peoples and perpetuate Canada's history of colonial violence. If elected, will you support the incorporation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples principles into project approval criteria, such as, for example, as required by the NEB and the CEAA? More broadly, how will your party contend with pressure from the energy industry and from other industrial interests in order to protect water, biodiversity, and the rights of Indigenous peoples? Let's begin this time with Mr. Kalmanovich.
Great, thank you. Yes, I would support the incorporation of the UNDRIP document into all project approvals. Not doing so is insulting to the Indigenous people of this land. And it's also a failed access of resources and knowledge that those people hold. And they're the most intimate people with the land. And I think that's disrespectful and a waste of collecting data and information and knowledge for moving forward on any project. So yes, simply put, we should not have financial gain through damage to our ecosystem or negatively impacting Indigenous settlements or communities. How do you balance the interest of a corporation that is destroying the planet and its living biosphere? These industries have externalized their damage to the biosphere for centuries. They want to continue to do so and say that they will do better from now on. You know, they quite often they say, hey, just give us another chance at building another mine. We'll do better. Not. I don't think that's acceptable. We've already seen their past practices. Past governments have fallen for this increment improvements, but at a great cost to the biosphere. Personally, I don't trust them. Their pursuit of corporate and personal profit blinds them. I want to see them clean up all of their mess first, and then maybe I'll talk with them. Too many times, large extractive corporations like the oil and gas industry in Alberta have externalized costs to the taxpayer and the environment. 28,000 abandoned oil wells or something like that. That's incredible. That's us that have to pay for that because these guys took all the money and scarpered. We should not be allowing this any longer. After the large corporations have removed their profits from the tar sands, for example, they will leave the cleanup and the damage for us, the taxpayers, to clean up. Mark my words.
Thank you very much.
No, this is not acceptable to me.
No problem at all. Thank you, Mr. Kalmanovich. Ms. McPherson, please.
Yeah. So, of course, the NDP would support the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Of course we would. In fact, Romeo Saganash, is the NDP Member of Parliament, had proposed that in our last, that we adhere to UNDRIP in our last parliamentary session. And it was struck down. So, you know, that is something we have always fought for and we will continue to fight for. My own personal research has been on how we use Indigenous knowledges, incorporate that into projects so that we can actually achieve sustainable development and make sure that we are giving Indigenous knowledges those same sort of role that we give all knowledges to make sure that we are able to get where we need to go, you know, that we have that every tool in our toolkit is being used to get to where we need to get to. it's so important that we make sure that we are not only respecting UNDRIP, but that we are also looking at the 94 recommendations under the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that that we are acknowledging our colonial past. I think in school we should be teaching, every single person should be learning the true history of our racist and colonial history. That should be part of our curriculum. It should be part of how we move forward and how we actually build our country. We need to redesign our nation-to-nation relationships. We have for so long talked about it and not actually done what needs to get done. It is not enough to stand at the front and do a land acknowledgement. It is not enough that we say it in our campaigns. We talk about it when we're at the campaign stage, and then when it actually comes to making sure that children in communities and Indigenous communities have the same rights to education as children elsewhere, that there is not boil water advisories in these communities, that there is, at this point, I'm sorry, but we have a government that is fighting children who need health benefits. They are taking them to court instead of paying for them to get the treatments they need. That is abysmal. So this discussion that we're going to renegotiate our relationship is false. We haven't done the work that needs to be done to do that. So there's a lot that needs to happen. I think the NDP have tried to take steps. We've tried to move our government forward on that, and I know we certainly will commit to that in the next Parliament.
Thank you very much. Ms. Olszewski.
Yes, thank you. I, of course, strongly support the incorporation of UNDRIP into project assessments, and in fact, it was the Liberal government that included UNDRIP in the new Impact Assessment Act. The Liberal government listened to what Indigenous people had to say following 14 months of consultation, and they came up with a framework of principles that are to be taken into account with respect to resource development that respect the rights and culture of Indigenous peoples. And if you look on the Government of Canada website, you'll find a list of those principles, and I don't have time to go through them all with you, but the framework builds on the consideration of potential impacts of projects on Indigenous people, on their rights, on their culture. It says that Indigenous peoples are to be consulted before project assessment, so in the pre-assessment phase, and that Indigenous participation in the process is to be ongoing. It mandates that Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science be taken into account, and the principles say what should be taken into account as well are the cumulative effects of a number of projects on a region of Indigenous peoples. I want to add to this that the Liberal government has also implemented, through Budget 2018, a new model for collaborative conservation efforts. And what this model does is it brings Indigenous governments, provincial and territorial governments together to make decisions for the betterment of all. And conservationists have in fact lauded the fact that leadership of Canada's Indigenous peoples in protecting our lands and waters has in fact been acknowledged. So supporting Indigenous peoples through their conservation efforts, I believe, is a fundamental and important contribution to reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we move on to our fourth question. I'm sorry, I'm
Getting ahead of the game. Sorry.
jumping the gun here.
Hard to know who started.
Very, very sorry. Mr. Cameron.
So the question is, will we support the incorporation of UNDRIP principles into project approval criteria? So the People's Party of Canada does aim to establish a strong relationship with our Indigenous communities based on mutual respect. We would support using UNDRIP principles through this process with our Indigenous communities, and I would expect that, while complex, the principles contained within UNDRIP exemplify the core values that our party aspires to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cameron. Now, the fourth question, the Green New Deal. So many Canadians have joined the growing call around the world for a concerted mobilization of the public sector in order to tackle the connected problems of climate change and social inequality and unemployment systematically, while deepening the protection of Indigenous civil and human rights through a Green New Deal. What policies would you prioritize for achieving the goals of a Green New Deal, and how would you ensure their effectiveness? Let's start now with Ms. McPherson.
So our platform, our entire platform is about building a more just society, building a more just Canada. I feel as somebody who's worked with the NDP for a very long time that, in fact, so much of what we see in the Green New Deal is already in the NDP platform and has been built over through our grassroots movements over decades. We have always championed, affordable healthcare availability. We're expanding it in this platform to include pharmacare. We've asked for dental care for people that have an income of under $70,000 per year. We've asked for mental care. This is stuff that we should have. It's been in our platform. We've been waiting. Jane Philpott just did an article the other day. We've been waiting for 22 years for the Conservatives and the Liberals to move on some of this thing. Some of the things in our Green New Deal is making sure that we are bringing everyone with us. It is so important, if we want to get where we need to go, that we don't leave people behind, that we don't leave anyone behind, that we make sure that we're moving forward and we're moving forward together, that we make sure that we're creating good green jobs for Canadians, that we're making sure that we have housing for Canadians, that Canadians can afford to live a life of dignity in this country, that that we are thinking of the supports that we need to provide to make sure all Canadians have the opportunity to prosper. We need to, of course, be looking at our relationship with Indigenous people and how we can work together on that. We need to be making sure that we're meeting our commitments to provide for those in our community that are less able to provide for themselves. We have commitments around the world as well. This is something I was shocked at, but that we are hearing from the Conservatives, who of course can't be here today to actually defend their own actions, that they want to cut our funding for overseas development assistance by 25%. We are already at the lowest rate we have ever been in the history of Canada in this country. So the fact that we want to cut 25%, under the Liberal plan to hold the number is atrocious, and then to cut it even more is absurd. So we have so many things, so many commitments that we want to do moving forward. We need to transfer to a low carbon economy. We need to do it faster than we're doing it. We need to do it more effectively than we're doing it, and we need to bring everyone with us while we do that.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. Ms. Olszewski.
Yes, thank you. I'm actually very proud to be part of a party that was ahead of the curve when it comes to taking steps to protect our environment, as well as taking into account civil rights and Indigenous rights. So long before people were talking about the Green New Deal, the Liberal Party had already committed to putting a price on carbon, investing in clean tech jobs, and revising the environmental assessment process so that we could restore public trust and credibility and confidence in that system. So the Liberal Party has, of course, set its goals and objectives and policies back in 2015, and it's building on those policies and objectives in Platform 2019. And one of the ways that we're doing this is to help by helping ordinary Canadians make their homes energy efficient. And this includes a proposal for permitting or giving people access to an interest-free loan for up to about $40,000 so that Canadians can do retrofits on their homes when they do these retrofits, they'll reduce their energy bills, they'll reduce their energy waste, and whether someone makes a decision to put in a high energy efficient furnace or new insulation or solar panels or an in-home car charger, Canadians can decide to use that money in whatever way they wish, and in return, they can save on their annual energy costs. And so the beauty of this too is we're talking about just New Deal and employment and unemployment is this is going to create a huge demand for people who will need to know how to do energy audits, which is something the government is going to be providing free of charge, how to do retrofitting, how to manufacture solar panels, how to do all of these things that incorporate the changes that we want to make as we progress to a clean society. And of course, what the Liberal government's pledged to do in Platform 2019 at the same time is invest in skills training to make sure that there's going to be a huge demand for this retrofitting, and people will take out these loans and they will take steps to retrofit their homes. We need to make sure there's going to be enough qualified workers to keep up with the demand. So this is a great example of the economy and the environment working hand in hand with job creation and skills training as part and parcel.
Thank you, Ms. Olszewski. Mr. Cameron.
Addressing climate change is a very challenging problem. Formally, the People's Party of Canada, the formal position is to leave it to the provinces to act. My personal position is that we can do more than that and should do more than that. The public sector may use different instruments to achieve the reductions that we want to achieve, either with a tax or a cap and trade or other instruments. I do feel that the Liberal and Conservative positions don't go far enough. The dollar per ton that's been assessed seems to be underestimated, and so it does need to be larger than that. As well, there's certainly an awareness campaign seemingly that has solidified support to do something about this problem. Just another note that the private sector also plays a role, but most importantly, to me at least, is that individuals and communities need to be connected to their choices and the impacts that those choices make. I believe that collectively, if we trust only in a government solution, this may absolve us of our own personal responsibilities. Just to outline, 20 years ago, I graduated from this university with an environmental biology degree. At that time, the Kyoto Protocol was the climate change working document. Established in 1997, I graduated in 1999, so it was right in the middle. Canada ratified it in 2002, withdrew in 2011. We additionally signed in the middle there an additional agreement, the Copenhagen Accord, that was a non-binding voluntary agreement, and the net result was inaction. So the lesson I take from that is that commitments made in non-binding voluntary agreements may not be achievable, and this is regrettable. So we can do more, we should do more. The public sector, the private sector do play a part, but I think most importantly, all individuals and communities need to be mindful of their choices and the impacts that they make. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cameron. Over to you.
Me. Thank you. That's me. You know, when I was listening to the Liberal candidate here, I kind of got the impression that the Liberals got it all covered. That, you know, we should just go home because, hey, we got this, we've been working on this, and everything's okay. Well, it's not okay. And so that's why we're here, because we want something different, we want something better. Wow, the Green New Deal is such an all-encompassing goal, but I find it as a kind of vague on specific details. I see it as a concept of what is possible and sets out aspiration for society. I believe that the Green New Deal is a minimum that we should aspire to. It has opened up dialogue on what is possible and what kind of goals we need to work towards to achieve some level of biosphere balance. A strong theme throughout the Green New Deal is a just transition, meaning that embarking on this path should not negatively impact people or this biosphere. This should include Indigenous peoples. I would not participate in a deal that did not have aspects of respect, consultation, human rights, etc. at its core. What good would a Green New Deal be if we see a large portion of our population disrespected, displaced, discriminated against, abused, etc.? That would not work for me. Planet and people, we are all one. And if anybody wants any more information, you can go to votemk.ca. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kalmanovich, and thank you all four panelists for your thoughtful responses to all of our questions. I just want to intervene quickly here before we move on with our schedule. We will be taking our break in approximately 10 minutes. If you can please formulate your questions on your sticky notes and have them passed to the end of your row ahead of time, that would be incredibly helpful for our co-moderators. Now, what I would like to do at this time is to invite Dr. Dougal MacDonald, candidate for the Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada, to the podium, who will have 5 minutes to respond.
Thank you. So I'm Dr. Dougal MacDonald, Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada candidate in Edmonton-Strathcona, and I'm the MLPC spokesperson on the environment. I teach at various universities, including this one. The MLPC has a website at www.cpcml.ca and a Facebook page which you can like. We produce a daily paper during the election called Renewal Update and other publications during non-election times. You could sign up to receive RU free every day in your email if you choose to, and we'll remain after the meeting to help you do that. Our main election message is about the need for democratic renewal. We want people to empower themselves and not depend on leaders and parties nobody trusts. People need to exercise control over decisions affecting their lives. We think Canadians are capable of representing themselves and speaking in their own name and are increasingly doing so. The recent climate actions led by the youth are great examples. Huge actions took place across Canada and around the world. Everyone spoke in their own name and put their demands on placards. People are clear that damage to the environment is mainly due to the greed of people in business and governments in their service. We do have the science to have a sustainable world. Damage to the environment is not the fault of individual behavior. We have no say in setting the direction of the economy and no powers to hold polluters like the energy monopolies to account. This raises an important issue. The need for people to sort out how to empower themselves, because without that, how do we guarantee the future for ourselves? The huge demonstrations worldwide tell us what people power looks like, and the youth are spearheading this. What the majority want cannot be denied. They just need to organize to get what they want. Various forces want to co-opt the youth. The ruling elites want to keep youth power in check. One way is by floating the Green New Deal, or GND. When viewing the GND, people must remind themselves that the crucial issue of safeguarding the natural environment must be taken up keeping in mind who controls the economy and the decision-making processes. So long as the people do not control their own destiny, decision-making about the environment is not in their hands. The resistance of people to pay the rich schemes and plunder of the land and resources protects the environment. Indigenous people upholding their hereditary rights as keepers of the land is fundamental, as are initiatives of young people to build a bright future for themselves. So too is the concrete support workers provide when Indigenous people and youth are fighting. The GND allegedly wants people to join together to pressure governments and the cartel parties and their political activists to combat climate change. But the real aim is to bring everyone into line behind the movement of the financial oligarchs for green investment. The GND is part of the public relations campaign to open up new areas of investment opportunities in green enterprises for those who already own and control the social wealth. Green investment exists within a climate of diminishing investment in the carbon sector. Many big banks and other funds now have selective policies regarding carbon investment, while also increasing investments in green enterprises. One call of those in power is to balance the economy and the environment, but this is irrational. An economy and an environment in which it exists cannot be separated. Hypocrisy exists at all levels of government. The purchase of the TMX pipeline, undermining of environmental assessment rules, broken promises to restore nation-to-nation relations with Indigenous peoples, and the $40 billion BC liquid natural gas project are prime examples. People are angry, but all of it hides that the workers do not control policy. Again, the main issue is who decides what is done and what is to be done. It reveals the fundamental need for people's empowerment. Demands of the First Nations for consultation are treated with utter disrespect. The GND emphasis on Indigenous involvement is an initiative to bring Indigenous leaders into the campaign for green and other investments, open up their territories, blunt resistance of their peoples, and lure them into the mainstream of joint investment possibilities under the control of the financial oligarchy. To better grasp the politics of the GND, we must examine what is missing. The GND says nothing on the need for democratic rule and political empowerment of the people. The GND accepts the established political arrangements where the vote empowers others over whom we exercise no control. The GND says nothing of the battles in defense of the rights of the people, has no comment on the anti-social offensive and how the financial oligarchy strengthens its overall control. And the GND says nothing of war preparations, and the military-industrial complex of Canada and the U.S. The U.S. military is the world's biggest polluter. Canada needs an anti-war government. A deliberation on the advisability of promoting the GND should keep in mind that what is missing is very relevant. Currently, people have no role in discussing how issues pose themselves. We are one people, and we need to establish together one nation-building project which upholds the rights of all.
Thank you very much, Dr. McDonald. I don't really. The one without
There's
the
here,
lip
you
stick.
can have Sam Lilly's. Dougal.
Have Sam's.
You can have Sam's.
This would be mine. All right. Next, I would like to turn it over to Ms. Naomi Rankin, the Communist Party candidate for our riding. She too will have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I'm going to jump to a conclusion here that a lot of people in this room are already environmentalists and environmental activists. And so I want to talk about how we are going to work together the day after the election. The Communist Party has a program for peace, full employment, environmental stewardship, national and human rights, and improved living conditions and living standards for working people. That's our platform for the election. That's also our platform for starting the day after the election and for the 46 or however many months it is until the next election campaign. Because even if a progressive majority is elected to Parliament, they're not going to be able to enact the sweeping changes that are needed and to really change the balance of forces in the country, in the economy, without real engagement and involvement from great masses, millions of ordinary working people. People are going to have to be more motivated, more aware, more active, more involved in the political process. And that's a kind of mass movement, a broad coalition that we need to build if we want to see a real action on the climate or on any other issue. So this is the basic strategy that we have advocated for a long time in the Communist Party. We call it an anti-monopoly coalition because on one side are a handful, literally a handful of giant corporations, multinationals, almost entirely foreign-owned. The classic example being in the oil and gas sector, who have completely encircled the political process. We know in Alberta they completely have the entire political process, all the political institutions, the whole realm of public debate under their control, and to a very great extent as well at the federal level. So I want to say, like to some of those other parties, I'm sorry, either God or Mammon. Either you are, in fact, going to take really strong action to protect the environment, or you're going to build pipelines. You cannot have it both ways. If we're going to protect the environment, the primary thing is we have to stop burning stuff. And one of the things that we have to stop burning is other people's cities. It's really important that this is not talked about a lot in this election. It's really important is that we have a policy of peace and a policy of the reduction of military spending and military production and an elimination of military exports. Right? For one thing, even if you didn't care about the misery and suffering that's caused around the world by wars and the threat of war, it's going to come back to bite us. You can't burn other people's cities without suffering the climate change effects of that as well. The Liberal government has announced the intention of raising our military spending by 75% over 10 years. This is the most craven capitulation to the worst of American foreign policy initiatives of making us more submissive than ever to U.S. foreign policy interests. They have been as bad as the Harper government before in terms of having policies of interfering in other countries, attempting to overthrow democratically elected governments in other countries. Whenever a government begins to act in the interests of their own country and resist the dictatorship of that handful of multinational corporations, there's suddenly a big propaganda campaign about what a terrible dictator the leader of that country is and how humanitarian it would be of us to start bombing their cities. Right? So the issue of peace, the issue of foreign policy, the issue of workers' rights, the issue of women's equality, the issue of Indigenous rights are all bound up together in the issue of environmental protection, environmental stewardship. So we want to work with all those different movements to bring them all together around a policy, a general platform that addresses all those interests, because fundamentally, the interests of the working people in Canada are all on one side. And it's fundamentally opposed to the interests of that handful of giant corporations. Remember, the Occupy movement had what was really a very excellent slogan. They talked about the 99%. But actually, I think they were a little bit wrong. It's actually the 99.999%. Right? The vast majority of people in this world are the ordinary working people, workers, small business. You could fit into a bus the number of individuals who really are on the other side, who have something to gain from runaway climate change. Thank you
very much. I would like to ask you all to join me in giving all of our candidates a very big round of applause. We will now have our 10-minute break. If you have not already offered your questions to one of our volunteers, please do so now. So you have time to stretch your legs, go visit the refreshment table, and we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Oh. Okay, everyone, let's get started again. Can you please take your seats?
Sure, that sounds great.
Whatever you like.
Give us a minute and we'll do a minute.
Well, it's representing yourself and your party on the issues of it was just
I think we got to do another little call out to our friend, Mr. Lilly. Because what happens is, oh, I'm sorry, Eleanor. What we end up doing is we bash each other and we don't have the conservative here to bash. One of these things is not here. Oh, I guess my mic's on.
Okay, take your seats, everyone, please. So our co-moderators have been working hard over the break, taking all of your comments and questions and trying to compile them and draw out a set of questions that are most representative of the themes and the concerns that seemed most prominent in your notes. And I want to remind you again what I mentioned at the beginning. If your question doesn't come up, I would encourage you to go ahead and follow up with your candidate or all the candidates with your questions. So let's get started. I'm going to be seeing these questions for the first time as well. Okay, so once again, candidates, you will each have 2 minutes to respond to each question. And we will, again, go in rotating order. So here's your question. What will you do to address generational inequity in a just transition to a zero-carbon economy? It is a good question. All right, so let's start. Trying to reorganize things. Let's start with Ms. Olszewski.
Sorry. So with respect to generational inequality and the transition to a zero carbon economy, I think that one of the most important things that we would need to deal with is employment issues to make sure that in the transition to a zero carbon economy, we don't leave anyone out in the cold, that we don't have individuals who have lost their income because they're in jobs or situations that are no longer supported by the transition to a green economy. And so I think I already dealt with some of what the Liberal government is doing already to support that transition. And I talked about skills training and about the jobs that would result from various kinds of environmental measures being taken and the transition to a clean economy. One of the things that the Liberal government has committed to do is to put into place a Just Transition Act, so a piece of legislation that would address these exact same issues, that would support workers and families and communities in the transition to a zero carbon economy. And I know that that is was one of the focuses, that type of legislation at the Paris Climate Accord. And when our government, if we're re-elected and we can implement this legislation, we will in fact be world leaders and one of the only countries in the world that we'll have implemented that legislation quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Olszewski. Mr. Cameron.
Well, I think I understand. I think maybe the federal function, or a federal function, would be to provide some guidance to forecast future needs for our citizens, such that individuals can know beforehand, like have a reasonable expectation of what the options are, of what they might need to do to change. I would echo Eleanor's comments about there will be employment issues, skills training, and I think that guidance would need to be aligned with that training. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cameron. Mr. Komanovich.
Well, I think we as a society will probably continue doing the same thing that we have done in the past. We rip off the future generations. But what I'm suggesting is that we do something different. And the youth are rallying and saying, no, we need something different. And I agree with them. We need something different. The status quo is people my age will vote in this upcoming election to hold on to the remnants of the past glory, make America great kind of ideology that is just destroying our society and also the planet. So what I would do was I would kind of try to get rid of people like me, okay, my age, our way of thinking, you know, because, well, whatever comes to mind. You know, I ride a bike, I'm vulnerable. So yeah, we need a complete change. And unless you guys ramp up and do it now, we're kind of screwed. And you guys need to make sure that you get your assurances or somebody in place that will make sure that you have a biosphere that will support your generation and the generations after you, because we did not do a very good job. My parents, my grandparents, we failed you, okay? We are leaving you pretty bad stuff. So.
Thank you very much, Mr. Komanovich. Ms. McPherson.
Yeah, so I think one of the things I wanted to mention about this is that I'm a mother, so I have 2 small children. And when I think of the climate crisis, like many of you in this room, we think about what this will mean for children that are coming. We're not thinking about how this may affect necessarily us. We're looking at why we want to create a better future for our children. We want to make sure there, in fact, is a future for our children. It's the impetus for why we are so concerned. It's why we see so many people here tonight. It is the underlying basis for all of that. Now, I can tell you, I've worked with young people at the Alberta Council for Global Cooperation, some of the most committed, amazing young people in Alberta. We've profiled some of the amazing work that they do, so we know just how awesome some of our Alberta people are in some of the work that we're doing on combating climate change. But there's a few things that we need to do to fix this. We need to make sure that our young people are getting the skills and the education that they need to get. And we have, over decades, increased the cost of tuition and education so much that only rich people can go to school. You are going to graduate with a $27,000 student debt when you graduate from university right now. I graduated not that long ago, well, sort of, not as long as you. Sorry. But it's 60% more expensive to get a degree. So we need to make that more accessible. The NDP is pushing to have student loans be interest-free. We're pushing to make sure that we have non-repayable student grants. We want to move towards free post-secondary tuition. I'm going to run out of time. And the most important thing for me is that we have jobs for people to take into. And our government has failed to diversify our economy. We don't have jobs right now in the green sector. We need to develop those green jobs, and we have failed to do it. And I could keep going, but I'm at 1-0.
But we
Thank
have
you
better music.
very much, Ms. McPherson. It always gets more interesting in the second round, doesn't it? Do we have another question?
Ask Linda. She'll know.
All right, so here is our second question. What is your party's position on the Trans Mountain Pipeline? Let's start with Mr. Cameron.
This one is straightforward. After an extensive approval process that seems to be lingering on and on, the People's Party of Canada does feel that the federal function is to assert the constitutional right, 9210, to push through pipelines if it's been deemed in the national interest.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cameron. Mr. Kalmanovich.
I'm really worried about this term, national interest. You know, people throw that around, and it's going to be used for all sorts of things. It's in the national interest. It's in Alberta's best interest. I'm against the Trans Mountain Pipeline, by the way. I don't think we should be building pipelines at the same time that we're saying that we want to take effective action on the climate crisis. You cannot do one and do the other. They are mutually exclusive. I say, let's take care of the climate crisis. Don't build pipelines. Don't continue burning fossil fuels. Don't create garbage or products that fill our landfill and our homes. That's not a very sustainable way to live or to leave the planet for a future generation. Getting back to the first one. It's not only finances, it's resources, it's also a healthy planet that we should be leaving them. So, no, I don't think it's in the national best interest to be building pipelines, especially with public money. That was an abuse of the Liberal government. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kalmanovich. Okay, Ms. McPherson.
Yeah, so I've thought about this an awful lot, a ton actually. This is the question that we've heard lots about. I hear it on the doorstep an awful lot. And you know, I'm going to take my lead from Linda Duncan, who has been such a strong advocate for us, and I'm going to say that what is missing in this whole discussion is that we have a crummy process. We have eviscerated our environmental laws under the Harper government, and we didn't fix that process, even though Justin Trudeau actually campaigned that he would fix our National Energy Board approval process. He didn't fix that process. So we actually can't approve pipelines without getting them bogged down in courts, without getting them bogged down in over and over and over in the courts. It's a real problem. So the process is, so from my perspective, what we need to do is we need to develop a strong process that looks at any energy project and looks at the upstream, the downstream, our constitutional obligations, our obligations under UNDRIP, and then if those projects are then approved with a strong process in place, then actually I would be supportive of them. I would be interested in that. I think we need to be able to move forward and ensure that we're protecting jobs and ensure that we're protecting Albertans, but we have to do it in a way that meets our obligations. We have to have a process in place. You know, it has been 10 years. We don't have a pipeline, and frankly, this pipeline isn't actually the panacea or the problem that we see it as. You know, Jason Kenney promised us that if he got into power, that the energy sector would bounce back, we'd be in this great place. We lost 6,000 jobs in Alberta in the energy sector because it's not coming back. It's not coming back that way. Okay, so what we need to do is stop this sort of divisive one or the other, you're either for or against, and start thinking, what is our national energy strategy? Oh, I always run out of time.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson.
I like the story there, though.
Ms. Olszewski.
Of course, our position is that we're moving ahead with Trans Mountain. When the Federal Court of Appeal said that we had to go back and redo consultations, that's exactly what we did so that we would move forward in the right way and in a way that's respectful to Indigenous peoples. We need another way of getting our resources, our Alberta resources, to market, and moving bitumen by rail is not safe, and it's not a sensible thing to do. When we make decisions as a government, we always have to consider the impact on families, on workers, and on communities, and that's exactly what we did when we made a decision with respect to the Trans Mountain Pipeline. to Ms. McPherson's comments about process, there is a brand new process in place after extensive consultations, the new Impact Assessment Act, and it tries to balance in the best way that it can moving forward so that proponents have some certainty with respect to resource projects and balancing that against taking appropriate care and concern for the environment. And I'm frankly a little bit shocked at Ms. McPherson's position with respect to pipelines and Trans Mountain Pipeline, because she certainly makes reference to Linda Duncan, but not to what her leader Jagmeet Singh has said repeatedly with respect to pipelines, and particularly with respect to TMX, which is that he doesn't support the pipeline and he'll fight the pipeline.
Thank you, Ms. Olszewski. Sorry, we won't have time for rebuttals, but potentially at the end we will have some time for each of you to have some closing comments. Let's move on to our next question. Let's do that at the end. Are we set? Okay, here we are. All right, so our third question. What steps will you take to address the incarceration and criminalization of climate activists, particularly those gendered and racialized bodies on the front lines? Ms. McPherson.
Sorry, I'll turn that on. I'm usually loud enough without it. So, you know, what we're seeing in Alberta with the war rooms, with the assaults on activists, on people that are fighting for climate, is absurd. It is utterly absurd, and we need to stop. That needs to end. The NDP will do everything in our power to ensure that those people that are fighting for our climate have a voice and have the ability to speak. You know, it's so important that people are at the table with us, that they are helping to make decisions, that we are developing a national strategy together, that we have Indigenous people at the table, that people have, you know, that we have activists, that we have perspectives from across the spectrum at the table. I have built my entire career on having difficult conversations with people that are on different sides of an issue. You know, in this very university last year, we brought together 1,200 people to talk about sustainable development, to talk about all the issues around it, and we made sure that there were academics in the room, that we made sure that there were private sector in the room, that we had people from all ranges of civil society, that we had people that were in the room having these conversations. And if you're not able to have the conversation, then you're not going to come up with a solution that will get us where we need to go. We need to protect people that are actually voicing their concerns. We need to make sure that our young people have the supports they need as they deal with some very, very real and very serious climate grief. And climate uncertainty in their own lives. There's a number of things we need to do, and the last thing we need to do is to have a war room. The last thing we need is a $30 million Google search to see who doesn't like environmentalists. So we would be pushing very, very hard against something like that.
Thank you very much, Ms. McPherson. Ms. Olszewski.
Yes, just very briefly. It is completely legitimate for citizens who have a perspective with respect to climate change to voice their concerns, to be heard by others. And I completely support any individuals or groups that wish to do that. And most certainly, it's as legitimate for someone to make a comment about how a project or some action that we might do might impact their hunting or their fishing or their lakes or their waterway or any of the other rights that they've enjoyed. It's absolutely appropriate for us to pay as much attention to that as we do to, you know, whatever comments are being made by people that support the actions that we wish to take. So I guess a quick answer is do support the right of activists and individuals to speak out about the things that matter to them.
Thank you, Ms. Olszewski. Mr. Cameron?
I would echo Eleanor's comments. Freedom of expression is key to our democracy. It's in our Constitution, and it's our right. People are free to express whatever their opinion is, and it's also equally the right of someone who's listening to that expression that they don't need to agree, but we must remain respectful, and we shouldn't act in punitive ways I mean, there are laws, of course, in violence and whatnot, but we do need to encourage people to speak up, remain respectful at all times, and the public discourse is an important thing that we need to encourage today. It doesn't seem to be happening as much as it ought to be. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cameron. Mr. Kalmanovich.
Yeah, great. Being one of those people that would probably be identified as person that should be incarcerated by the Alberta government, I don't support this. So I'm the person that started the climate strikes on Fridays in Edmonton. I helped found the local chapter of Extinction Rebellion in Edmonton. I'm the person that started the Eco Grief Groups circle in Edmonton. And I proudly wear this T-shirt. Yeah, so I should have the 1-800-SNITCH line on the back so you guys can report me. But, I will take donations for my legal fees as well, please. Thank you very much. Oh, will you do that pro bono, Linda? Oh, okay. Okay, but anyway, I'm looking for a good, cheap lawyer. Okay, thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Kalmanovich. I believe we have a fourth question. All right, fourth question for the evening. How do we ensure meaningful international political cooperation on climate change? I'm going to come back to you, Mr. Kalmanovich, because you haven't had an opportunity to start this round yet.
Great, thank you. You know, a lot of times people say, what about China? What about United States and things? That's the number one thing. Well, historically, Canada is the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases over history. Okay? So we do not have clean hands. I was working in the garden today. I don't have clean hands. But when
How did
we...
you have time to work in the garden today?
I don't know. I was directing people. So, you know, we have to do something, and then we might have some legitimacy to be able to go to the international community and say, listen, we are taking steps. We are taking real steps. And we need you to jump on board with us. Because if we just wag our finger and say, you know, we need to do that, and what we won't do this until you guys do it. So I'm in a canoe, and I'm canoeing down the river, and I noticed that there's a leak beside me. And water's coming in. I'm thinking, shall I tell all the other people? And then I realized the guy in front of me, there's a hole beside him, but his hole is bigger than mine. So, you know, and the other guy is even bigger. So why should I do anything about my hole? Because everybody else has a bigger hole than I. But as they're approaching the waterfall, they realize it doesn't bloody well matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kalmanovich. Ms. McPherson, please.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this. So there's a few things we can do to make sure that we have a good response. This has been something I've done for the last 10 years at ACGC. And one of the things that we can do is we can commit to 0.7% of gross national income for international development. This is something that Pearson put into place for Canada, put it into place a long time ago. Do you know that in this country, we are now at 0.26 of GNI is what we spend overseas. I was at a seniors center just the other day, and they were all talking about how we spend too much money, we send too much overseas. They were thinking we were sending 10% of our gross national income. 0.25% goes to support that. You know what? We should have all kinds of funds available for mitigation, for helping with adaptation and helping with mitigation overseas. And there's another thing that we really need to be aware of. Because we haven't done the work on climate change, there is going to be a mass refugee crisis that is growing. It has already started and it will continue to grow. And we need to allow for immigration into this country because there are going to be climate refugees that have nowhere to go. There are literally going to be countries underwater. So those are a few of the things that we need to do. Increase our ODA, commit to what is our obligation in the world stage. Canada we always have thought of ourselves as hitting above our weight when it comes to international development. And we have dropped the ball, and we still seem to think that we're doing this great thing, and we aren't there anymore. This tapping your chest and saying Canada's back is a lie. We're not doing our role internationally. So the other thing that I think we need to look at is the opportunity that comes with our overseas development assistance. We should be exporting our innovations. We should be able to develop these great green innovations and export them around the world. That's such an opportunity we're missing. I'm out.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. Ms. Olszewski, please.
Yes, so the question is, how do we ensure meaningful international cooperation on climate change? And the way that we certainly do this is by showing climate leadership. We do that by setting ambitious targets, by doing our best to meet those targets, by communicating with other countries with respect to targets, by showing leadership in other ways like the just transition legislation that we talked about earlier, by being a leader in those areas. Certainly the way that we don't do it is by looking inwards, by building walls, by cutting ourselves off from other countries as our neighbor to the south has done. And absolutely, climate change and protecting our environment are global issues and global concerns that require a global response. It's not going to serve us at all to just sort of hide within our own walls in our own country and say that we're going to solve things on our own. And it is true that certainly climate change will be devastating, has already been devastating on some countries, and it will lead to climate migration. And at some point in time, there'll be many, many people who need to be accommodated because they have to flee their countries because of drought and other weather issues. And so again, the issue of human migration is a global issue that can't be solved, as I say, by building walls. This can be solved by building bridges with other countries.
Thank you, Ms. Olszewski.
Thank you.
Mr. Cameron.
How do we make meaningful international cooperation on climate change? I guess I would just like to start by saying that if the international community has spent the effort, the time to come to some consensus on what an appropriate approach is to the solution, we shouldn't just walk away from that. There may be imperfect things with these agreements, but I think we ought to work to fix these agreements if there's disagreements with them. Yeah, we should stick with those agreements for sure. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Cameron. So that completes our scheduled activity. Since you guys were so efficient, we do have a little bit of extra time. And so I wanted to give you each an opportunity to offer some closing comments if you so choose. I think we have time for a maximum of 2 minutes per candidate. Let me see if I can get our order right. I think Mr. Cameron, would you like to go first?
Sure. Again, just to address climate change, we can do more, we should do more, but we must be wary of a government-only solution, as this may not connect individuals to the responsibilities they have in making informed choices. Again, I would like to just thank the organizers for the opportunity. The nuances between our political viewpoints and considered discussion of them is what makes our democracy strong. I encourage all to vote on October 21 and vote your values. Again, thank you to the other candidates here up at the front. You do have my commitment, if elected, to work with you, to listen, to have an open door policy, and work hard to represent your voice in Parliament. And if it's not Justin Trudeau, Andrew Scheer, Elizabeth May, or Jagmeet Singh, the none of the above option could be the principled alternative, the People's Party of Canada. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cameron. Let's go with, what's our order here? How about Mr. Kalmanovich?
Oh, could I use the podium?
Sure.
Could I have my assistant? So, I love props. So, yeah. Does anybody know what this is? It's a scarf. That's very good. So this is the climate scarf. This is the Edmonton climate scarf. The white represents the 20th century average. The blues, there's 3 different values of blues. They represent 1, 2, and 3 degrees below the zero. And the reds represent 1, 2, and 3 degrees above zero, the average of that century. So, because climate is about weather over a long period of time. So all the scientist bodies in the world are using the 20th century as our base standard. So my friend over here is standing in 1880, and notice all the blue down at that end. I'm standing over here in all the red. So this was when I was born. I've had a pretty warm existence compared to my friend over there. So I think that this kind of represents where we're at and what we should avoid. Because you know what? This pattern is only just going to continue. It's not looking good. 1.5 isn't good enough. We should be doing much better, further. We must go further, and we must go faster. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Kalmanovich. Ms. McPherson.
I don't have a scarf. I'm not good at knitting. So this election is actually going to be one of the most important elections we will see. We are at a moment where potentially in Alberta, we could send a full slate of Conservative candidates to Ottawa. I have to tell you, they don't even come. They don't even think they need to show up to actually win a seat in Alberta. So it is going to be so important that we are able to hold one progressive seat. I'm going to tell you, I am the only candidate that has experience representing Alberta at the local, at the national, and at the international stage. I think it's very important that we look at the history of this riding as well and recognize that in Edmonton-Strathcona, your MP on October 26th will be a Conservative or a New Democrat. Those are the 2 options that we have. Now, we know that's not necessarily the case federally. There are 4 different leaders. They will all do what they can. We likely will have, a Conservative or a Liberal government, but you don't get to vote for Justin Trudeau. You don't get to vote for Andrew Scheer. You can vote for your candidate. And I guarantee you that I have the best mentors in the world. Linda Duncan is with us here, and she is an amazing constituent MP that I am going to learn from. My MLA is Rachel Notley, and I have learned very many things from her. So I promise to be the best constituent member of Parliament, and we need you all to vote, and we need you to grab 10 of your friends and make sure everybody gets to the polls. If you can't do it on October 5th, at least before October 21st.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson.
Nice.
Ms. Olszewski.
Yes, I find myself in a position of having to disagree with Ms. McPherson again. She is not the only person in the room that can be a successful, running to be a successful MP in this riding. That is not, the only option is not NDP or Conservative. That's absolutely untrue. I've been working really hard on this riding. This is my second time running. I worked hard 17 months last time. I've knocked on 30,000 doors, my team and myself. Over the last year or so, I've talked to multiple people in this riding. They want a progressive voice in Ottawa. Most of us at the table tonight agree on a lot of things that we talked about. It's just a matter of degree. We know what party doesn't agree with most of the things that we've talked about this evening, and we also know that it's a two-horse race for who's going to be the Prime Minister of this country. It's going to be Mr. Scheer or Mr. Trudeau, and we are asking progressive voters to protect the tremendous progress that the Liberal government's made in this country with respect to the environment and acting on climate change. And I want to add that there was a Main Street poll done in September, and that it shows the Conservatives in first place and the Liberals in second place. So it's absolutely possible for us as a progressive Liberal voice for me to be the next MP in Edmonton-Strathcona, and I would very much like to do that. I've worked hard to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Olszewski. Dr. McDonald, would you like to take the podium for some closing comments?
So as I said, our party believes that the main issue is empowering people and empowering them to take their decisions into their own hands and decide what should be done. For example, about pipelines, about the transition to carbon-free and zero fossil fuels and so on. That's the key issue here. Who has power? And it's important that we see that there are several really powerful forces that are coming forward. One is definitely the youth. Everyone realizes that, you know, it was the youth who led these demonstrations, and the one that was last Friday was 4,000 people, which is the largest demonstration in Edmonton since the one in the against the Iraq War in 2002. So it was a sign of an actual movement, not just a rally where everybody's going to go home and be quiet again. Our party is a strong advocate for Canadians to speak their minds, and these environmentalists, they definitely have the right to agitate for what they think will provide solutions to the problems we face. By participating in organizing their peers and providing problems with solutions, people empower themselves, and that's what they're doing. They're making headway, and they're going to make more headway. As I said, it's a movement. It's not a bunch of demonstration.
Thank you. Ms. Rankin, would you like to take the podium?
Yes. Okay. The technical solutions to the climate problem we already have. We don't have to wait for new research. We don't have to hope that some breakthrough occurs in the future. What we need to do is already known, understood, in place. All we need is the political will. All we need is a government that actually takes the side of working people and will implement a program. We need sweeping changes in the economy, right? And I mean, I don't like it myself. I'm a very conservative person by temperament. I like things to stay the same. I don't like to deal with change. But too bad for me. I mean, the change is coming. The change could be catastrophe if we go on with business as usual. or the change could be really sweeping. We read, a really high level of public ownership and democratic control to really rework the whole economy, because we need a powerful movement to promote this, and we need to have the working class in the forefront of that movement. And that means that movement has to put front and center full employment. Because it's too late to ask the working class to shoulder the burden and to make the sacrifices. Let the corporations make the sacrifices for once.
Absolutely.
I remember what one person said back in the 80s when there's a big upsurge of the peace movement, is that he aspired for this movement to be courted by politicians and feared by the police. And that's what I want for the environmental movement, that it should be powerful, that it should set the agenda, and it should insist upon, this environment is going to be restored. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rankin. And please join me in thanking all of our candidates for joining us today. I also want to thank each of you for attending this evening and being informed voters. So thank you for coming. I also want to once again thank our sponsors, and I want to highlight the Energy Management and Sustainability Operations, the Sociology Department of the University of Alberta, the Cool Institute for Advanced Studies. My daughter corrected my pronunciation of cool. Been saying Cooley for years now, and the Sustainability Council. So I much appreciate the contributions they made to make this happen. I also want to thank our organizing committee and our translator who was on hand for the evening, and the many volunteers who made this evening possible. You will find the video recording of this event on the internet. We should have a website posted where you can find that very shortly. And I wanted to let you know that all of your sticky notes are now posted outside in the lobby. So take a look around to see what your other members of the community, what concerns they're sharing with you. And finally, please vote on October 21st. Thanks again.
Good job. Nice scarf. Nice scarf.
See ya. Thanks a lot.